embarrassing moments of my teaching career there. So, okay, we've got open up Rhino here, and what I want to go over is just the basic overview of the interface today, and so the way that Rhino is set up, it opens up into 4 different viewports. So you have a top, a front, right, and perspective viewport. And then you also have a series of, well, you have a command line up at the top, and so you can type in commands like line or what have you. And if you start to type in what you think it is, it will bring up a whole list of what it possibly could be. So that's a very handy, useful tool when you're learning this, because you may not know the exact command that you want, but you know it starts with an L. You know, it may have something to do with lines or curves, so you can type it in there and it'll give you a list of things. It'll also show you results. So if you type something like a distance, or you are asking for an area, it will display in this area here. Okay, and then right below that, I'm going to get to this in a minute, but right below that are these series of tabs, and each of these tabs are basically aligned with a different type of the tools that you need for working in specific elements. So standard tools come up with your file, open, close, copy to clipboard, all of those things. Panning the views. Now you'll notice if you hover over them, it will show you what the shortcut will be. So like shift, right mouse button will pan. And orbit is control shift, but you can also just click on those and manually move these things around. And if you're opening up this new, then you also have this help thing here that will show you specifically how to use the tool. It usually has a little bit of a video as well, which is quite handy to have. And zoom extents, zoom selected, so if you have an item that's selected, you can zoom in. And then there's this different viewport layouts. So this is one layout, but we could have just 3 viewports. We can change up these different viewports. So that's a helpful sort of tool that we'll get into in a little while. Then we get into some layer managements and some other things, but and then over here we have the main tool set that is the creation tool set. So we can think about this as the upper part is creating things, and the middle part is breaking things, and then the lower part is transforming things. So changing and modifying. Just to go through these a little bit. Similar to almost all the other programs, you have a selection command in which you select things with. You can create points and lines, and then just like in Photoshop and Illustrator, these little corner arrows denote a flyout. So if you hold it down, it'll pop out a whole list of other additional commands. Switch over here. And then so we can create lines and shapes. So generally the way the concept behind Rhino is that you create a framework or a supporting geometry, and then using that as a framework you can create surfaces from that, because this is what we call a surface modeler. And it uses, like Illustrator, it uses vector definitions of surfaces called NURBS, and they are mathematical definitions of surfaces so that they are super fine resolution. So that's very different than like a program like SketchUp, for instance, in which is considered a polygon modeler, which the facets, so if you draw a circle in SketchUp, for instance, it's actually made up of a certain number of straight line segments, whereas a circle here is actually a real circle, and it's a mathematical definition of a circle. So if you zoom in, no matter how much you zoom in, it's always going to be a perfect circle and a perfect curve. So for modeling tolerances and for high precision modeling, this is super precise. So that's really good. And you know, this software is also used to model boats and things like that with much more organic shapes because of the precision and some of the curve tools that it's allowed to, or it has built into it. So it's very good that way, and that's why it's very different than most other modeling softwares. So if we go to the next tab, will be construction planes. So you'll notice that for generally doing two-dimensional work or architectural sort of work, a construction plane is basically telling the computer what's the plane of surface that you want to create something on. And so what you can do, sometimes you can imagine that, let's say I have this surface here, and it's at this angle, and I want to create a punch a hole in this, for instance, or I want to add a piece of geometry onto this piece of thing. So one way to do it is to create the geometry and then move it and snap it and try to make it fit onto there. But we can tell it, use this surface and make it a construction plane, and then all my geometry that I start to create starts to happen on that surface. So I don't have to worry about angles or any of that. It's just nice and clean. And so as you get into more complex geometry and more complex modeling, those kind of being able to define the surface planes, the construction planes is an important piece. And as we get into the modeling, getting into algorithmic design using Grasshopper, construction planes also become super important in being able to generate geometry off of that. But for now, we're not going to necessarily mess with those too much. I just want you to know what those are about. We have a whole set of viewing tools where we can obviously look at axonometric, and we can change, we can add cameras, which are super nice. We can also change the display. So you have some presets here, kind of like SketchUp styles. But we also have the ability to look at that over here, but this will change your display. Selection is also a key point. This is one thing that's really nice, is there's a whole myriad of different selection tools, so you can automatically filter and say I only want to pick lines, or I only want to pick surfaces, or I only want to pick meshes, or hatches, or any sort of thing. You can selectively select those right here. Viewport layouts, again, that's just an extension of being able to modify how you work, which is nice. Visibility, again, we'll work into that a little bit, but it's oftentimes being able to select a piece of geometry and hide it so that you can get inside and work on other geometry is helpful. Using visibility with layers is also incredibly helpful. The transform tool, we have the set of different transforms, and this is where one of the strengths of Rhino is the ability to modify geometry because of its NURBS nature, its mathematical nature. We can modify it pretty radically without it breaking and doing weird stuff. So here's a whole set of those. Obviously, we have scale. Couple of things about the scale tool is that you can do it as three-dimensional scaling, two-dimensional scaling, or one-dimensional non-linear. So you can just scale one axis, which is nice. Mirroring, orienting is something that you'll find really I use a ton. Being able to, like I said before, create a piece of geometry and orient it onto something else, and also have it scale. There's a few different options there. Bending, twisting, shearing, all of those are part of it. Curve tools, almost everything that you'll start with, or at least, so here's the other thing, like I told you in Photoshop and Illustrator, there's probably 5 different ways that you can accomplish any modeling task. Okay, so I'm going to show you how I model. And Byron has a way of modeling, Eric has a way of modeling, and so it's good to talk to all of us, listen to me, but go and talk to these guys and play with it yourself, because you'll find your style and your technique And for me, I like the idea of being constructed based on lines and thinking about it in terms of framework rather than solids. So I use a lot of creating lines first and then generating surfaces from lines. And there's a lot of powerful tools for doing that here. And you'll notice that when I switch these tabs, this toolbar changes. So it changes both this horizontal and the vertical set when we look at those. And then for the same thing, we have a ton of different surface tools. The ability to offset surfaces, which is really nice. You can fillet the corners and chamfer corners, do some really interesting things about that. And then there's solid tools. So once you create a surface that becomes enclosed, it can recognize it as a solid. So these are the kind of tools that you'll be using if you're imagining wanting to 3D print something, on our 3D printers. These are the kind of tools that you'll start to use to make sure that it's actually a solid and that it's watertight and it will be able to be printed without error. And so those kind of solid tools are similar to the Boolean tools. So thinking about the union and addition and subtraction and intersection tools that we used in Pathfinder and Illustrator, very similar concept. So imagining a cube and then being able to subtract from a cube is that kind of set of tools. We have mesh tools. So once you start to develop a solid, if you want to render it or transfer it to another rendering software or transfer it to another piece of software, some software utilizes and understands NURBS, but a lot of them do not. So you have to change it and put it in as a mesh. And so basically what you're doing is transforming that surface and approximating those surfaces into polygons. Okay? And so then it becomes static and it becomes faceted in a way. So there's an extensive set of tools to create meshes and to modify meshes. And this will come in, so if you bring in something from SketchUp or you bring in something from Revit or AutoCAD or something like that, it's usually going to come in some form like a mesh if there's surfaces. There's some basic rendering tools. I would suggest that you get on McNeil's Rhino site and download a plugin called Neon. And what it does is it has a real-time rendering. So it will do real-time rendering in one of these perspective windows. And I've actually been using that quite a bit because there's no setup involved. You just click it and let it go, and it works out really nicely. Yeah. Just go to rhino3d.com and then search for Neon. And you can download it, and it's a beta version, so they're working on it. So you'll probably have to update it a few times, but it's a really nice little tool. And let's see here. So, and then there's a whole set of drafting tools. So if you wanted to do your drawings right in Rhino, although we're not going to do that, we're not going to cover the drafting tools because we're going to be transferring these things into Revit, and so that you can get familiar with the interface of Revit and doing 2D drawings there. And then these two tabs, the food for Rhino, you probably don't have because that's a way of getting different plugins. And okay, so that's the basic overview for this layout. And then over here we have a set of pallets. And these different palettes are similar. They work the same way as the palettes in Photoshop or Illustrator, where we can go over to the panels here. In Photoshop and Illustrator, it was windows, and we can choose which ones of these we want to have as tabs over here. And basically, they are showing you the information for any particular one of these. So if we have, let's say, a line, let's create a box real quick. Let's go. So I create this box and I'll select it. Now if I go over here to properties, which is this circular rainbow thing, it'll show me what it is, what layer it's on, what color it should be displayed at, what line type. So basically all of the information that makes up and what you can modify. We can name it so it can have individual names, and so that's a way of being, and we can select by name, so that's pretty handy. And then we also have the ability to apply certain materials to it if we want it to look a certain way, and do some mapping, but we're not going to get into that right now. But suffice to say that that's a really handy tool. We also have the other big one is this pie chart, this kind of rainbow pie chart thing. That's your layer tab, and that becomes really important because, again, layers, I can't emphasize enough, keeping your stuff organized and separated will make the difference between you having sleep some nights and not. Okay, so just get in the habit of being careful about how you model things and how you organize your models. That's really important. Let's see, I'm going to go into so thinking about the environment. So when we model, we can choose this thing to have an environment that it's in. I'm going to put this on. We can also go over here to this display tab. Computer's thinking. So this little monitor looking thing, it allows us to show what objects, what types of things, and how these things are displayed in any sort of viewport. And each of these viewport, you could have like 4 different perspective views, and you could have some that show just the lights, some that just show the models, some that just show curves, and you can check all of those on and off right here, which makes it super handy. I'm just going to go over to the environment, and I'm just going to put in an environment so you can see what this neon rendering thing does. They have some built-in environments which are useful. Okay, so while that's rendering, let's move down through here. I didn't go through all of the panels because you probably don't have some of these panels like the lights and stuff that I've turned on. But if we go down to the bottom here, we also have a set of viewports and tabs. So I can choose to select any one of these different tabs. So up in the corners here, this can decide, and so we can also choose to select which of the active viewports that we're looking at right here, which is also nice. The other thing we can do is if we double click on any one of these, it becomes full screen. And if I'm using that as full screen and then I click down below, you'll notice that it's changing the viewport, which is nice. And if you double click it again, it goes back to its smaller viewport. I'm going to turn off this neon rendering because it's slowing it. So you just notice what I was doing there. If I click on the little arrow key, it brings up all of the things that I can do with this viewport. So it has these different rendering styles. I generally like to use ghosted as a rendering style because you can see through the object, but you can still see the surfaces. It makes it really nice and handy. But there's technical, so if you choose technical, it starts to show it as dotted and hitted lines. Artistic and pen makes it kind of fancy. I think they look stupid, but that's other people's opinions on that. So, and then the other important thing down at this bottom here is the ability to snap to different objects. So if I'm creating a line and I want it to come off of this corner here, what I can do is I can come down here and say that I want to snap this to endpoints or near an object or to a point or to the midpoint or center line or where it intersects between the two things. I can also select things that are perpendicular, tangent to. I can look at knots. We'll get into knots later. And then there's also this idea here of projection. And so remember how I talked about construction planes? So when we're working in 3D space, sometimes when you're drawing a perspective, it doesn't know exactly. It's going to guess which plane that you're on. And you can use projection to make sure that it's always being drawn on that construction plane. So that can be helpful. You can quickly turn off these things. And then below that, here we have what C-plane you're working on, the coordinate systems down below, and the scale that you're working in. Right-clicking on this, we can change the scales. So we could say, oh, I don't want to work in inches, I want to work in feet, or I want to work in meters. Right next to that as well is the layer. So this tells you what layer that you're working on. And if I have an object selected, for instance, let's go select this object. I can also just click on this here and quickly move it to another layer, which is super handy, creating and then moving to layers. And those layers can be locked and things. We can also set up our snaps. As we go down the bottom, we have grid snaps, which will snap to each of these grid points. The other one that you'll probably use a lot and turn on and off quite a bit is the ortho, which will basically restrict the lines to moving in like 90 and 90 degree angles, horizontal or vertical. That becomes really handy. There's also, similar to Illustrator Smart Guides, we have this Smart Track in which it will infer what you want from the geometry. So I could, let's go over here, and infer, okay, I want to make a line, but I want it to be kind of parallel to that, lined up with that point. So it brings out that white guideline that you can see there. And that allows me to then draw that's inferred, and if I want it to be there, I hover over until it turns white, and now it's going to be set up like that, and you can see that I have that it's going to intersect. Click that and bam, pretty easy. The gumball is kind of interesting because what that is when you select an object, it brings up this arrow tool, and that's what the gumball is. So if I turn that gumball off, that arrow goes away. And basically this is a shortcut to being able to modify and move this thing around. So if I select on the blue arrow, I can move this thing up and down, and that's constrained to that axis. Same thing. If I move over to one of these planes, it's going to restrict it to moving in a two axis, like the red and the blue axis. Or if I have the other, I can switch it to the red and the green axis. I can rotate by choosing to grab onto that. And I can rotate it in any one of these directions. I can also scale this thing based on a dimension. That becomes kind of handy. The gumball is pretty new to Rhino, so I haven't really used it in my workflow too much, so when we're going through these tutorials and stuff, I may or may not use it. I might have it turned off quite a bit. The last piece is this record history, and the record history is a tool that you probably won't use too often, but it's the basis of Grasshopper and these other plugins, and that is what it does is it remembers. So as you, like, say you're creating geometry, let's create a surface. I'm going to use as control point. I'm going to go to, I'm going to double click and make this perspective. I'm going to select this guy, delete him. I'm going to delete this line I just created. In fact, I'm going to do, I'm just going to turn off this grid so you can see what we're doing a little bit better. Okay, so I'm going to create a line. So I'm just going to use this control point curve. And there's a couple of different ways that we can do curves, so we'll get into that on Friday. But I'm just going to drag. I'm going to turn off ortho 2, but I'm going to have project turned on. And so I'm just going to create a curve. Hit enter when you're done, and it'll close the curve. And I'm going to create another curve. Enter. And if I take these two curves, and then I'm going to create one more curve, snap to the end, and then I'm going to make a surface out of this. So if I go to Surface Tools, and I can go over here and I can look at like lofting or choosing these different methods. But here we get down to sweeping. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this curve here, and I'm going to use these two curves as a guide, and basically I'm going to tell it to run that section curve all the way through there to create a surface. So we do that by clicking on the sweep two rails, select, it tells you what it's looking for. Select the first rail, select the second rail, and select the cross-sectional curve, which is that, and then hit enter when you're done. And so we've created this surface. So I'm going to click OK. So when I have this surface here, if I go and I want to modify this surface, because it was created with these curves, if I modify the curve, if we go back to the standard tab and then click on this points on, it shows me those control points. So I should be able to select this point. Let's turn on the gumball. And modify it. But you notice that the surface doesn't change because it's not related anymore. It's not parametrically related. So what we can do is we can turn on record history and do the same thing while it's turned on and do this sweep two rails. So we'll go to surface, or we can just type sweep two. It pops up. That's what I want. So I'm going to select that edge, and that edge, and hit enter. Bam. Okay, so Now though, because I recorded its history, now if I come over here and start to modify this, it changes that surface and it keeps that surface changed. So I'm going to double click up here, go back to the 4 surfaces. So now if I start to modify this in 3 dimensions, it starts to modify totally the underlying structure. So that's what the record history is, and that becomes the basis of how Grasshopper works and being able to make parametric models based on that. So that's a really handy tool to use. Just keep that in mind as you're going, looking at it. So that's the basic interface and basic way in which one example of how to utilize curves to make a surface. And you can see how it very easily starts to be able to model these surfaces and create organic shapes. But this works also just as well as a box modeler, and to do rectilinear forms and that as well. So this was a basic overview for you to take a look at. I am going to post a series of links that are tutorials that I found online that can give you an introduction to take you further, so you guys can study this on your own time. And then on Friday, we're going to get into the basic creation of basic software, of basic shapes, and how to modify them, move them, combine them, trim them. Just very simple stuff to get you started. And by Friday, you should have the tools that you need to begin modeling your the Snøhetta project. Okay, so with that, we're going to I'm going to have some other resources up in that assignment that will have plans and sections and that are dimensioned that you could use as a basis. And we'll get into how to use those as a basis, as backgrounds, and to help you model accurately. And as we go through each of these stages, each week we'll be focusing on just one aspect of modeling this piece. And so by the end of this next few weeks, you'll have the terrain modeled, you'll have the object, the pavilion modeled, and you'll have it modeled to a certain level of detail that then we can take that into Revit and use that to start creating your 2D drawings and technical drawings from that. Okay, so take a look at probably later this afternoon. Check out the assignment webpage and on Angel, and there'll be some links to these tutorials to take a look at. And again, this is something that you're going to have to invest a little bit of your time outside of school to learn and utilize, because it's too complicated for me to go over everything. I'm going to give you the basics, and but the power of it is what you'll find if you explore for yourself. Okay? All right, so have a good day, and I won't see you on Friday, but Eric and Brian will. Byron.